The clock above Woolworth's department store read 6:47 p.m. when 19-year-old Linda Morrison pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the crisp March evening. The year was 1969, and Rockford, Illinois was alive with the promise of spring, snow melting in dirty patches along the sidewalks, the first brave crocuses pushing through the thawing earth in Lincoln Park. Linda pulled her bright red wool coat tight against the wind that swept down State Street, her breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. She had seemed different that day, nervous. Her coworker Susan Palmer would later tell police that Linda kept glancing at the clock during their shift, her usually steady hands trembling as she arranged costume jewelry in the display case. When the phone rang at the employee desk at 5:30 p.m., Linda's face had gone pale. Whatever the caller said lasted only 30 seconds, but it was enough to leave Linda visibly shaken. Now, as Linda walked east toward the bus stop on Madison Street, the familiar sounds of downtown Rockford surrounded her. Car engines humming, the distant clatter of dishes from Romano's Italian restaurant, the cheerful bell above Kresge's Five and Dime as customers hurried in and out. Normal sounds of a normal evening in a normal American town. But nothing about this evening would prove normal. Linda's red coat made her easy to spot in the crowd. Mrs. Dorothy Henkel, sweeping her front porch 2 blocks away, watched Linda pass under the streetlight at the corner of State and Madison. The girl's pace seemed hurried, purposeful. She kept looking over her shoulder, as if someone might be following. At 7:15 p.m., teenage Bobby Crawford saw Linda talking to someone in a dark sedan parked near Riverside Park. The conversation appeared intense, urgent. Linda leaned down toward the driver's window, her hands pressed against the car door. When Bobby looked again 5 minutes later, both Linda and the car were gone. The last confirmed sighting came from elderly Mr. Albert Peterson, who was walking his terrier near the Rock River at 7:34 p.m. He saw a young woman in a red coat standing by the walking path that led into the woods. She appeared to be waiting for someone. After that moment, Linda Morrison simply vanished. Back on Cherry Street, her mother Patricia kept glancing at the kitchen clock above the stove. The pot roast was getting dry. Linda's favorite green beans were turning mushy. The mashed potatoes had formed a skin on top. Linda was never late for dinner without calling. Never. What happened in those 47 minutes between Linda leaving Woolworth's and disappearing near the river would haunt this quiet Illinois town for 56 years. Hidden within those minutes was a secret so devastating, so unthinkable, that when it finally surfaced, it would destroy everything the Morrison family thought they knew about themselves. Linda Morrison was the kind of girl who made people smile just by walking into a room. Born on Christmas Day 1949, she was the baby of the Morrison family, arriving 12 years after her closest sibling and bringing unexpected joy to parents who thought their family was complete. Her 3 older brothers, Michael, Patrick, and David, doted on their little sister with the fierce protectiveness that only big brothers could provide. The Morrison family lived in a modest 2-story house on Cherry Street, in the kind of neighborhood where children played kick the can until dark and mothers called them home for dinner by hollering from front porches. Frank Morrison worked the morning shift at the Rockford Tool Company, his hands permanently stained with machine oil, his lunch pail rattling with the thermoses and sandwiches Patricia packed each dawn. Patricia kept house with the meticulous care of a woman who took pride in hospital corners and spotless windows, but her real passion was reserved for her garden, where she coaxed prize-winning roses from the stubborn Illinois soil. Linda had inherited her mother's nurturing nature and her father's stubborn determination. While other girls her age were dreaming of wedding dresses and white picket fences, Linda had her sights set on nursing school. She kept a stack of medical textbooks on her nightstand, borrowed from the Rockford Public Library, and could recite the names of every bone in the human body. Her bedroom walls were covered with acceptance letters from nursing programs across the Midwest, each representing a future she was determined to build with her own hands. The job at Woolworth's was meant to be temporary, a way to save money for tuition and textbooks. Linda worked the late afternoon shift, straightening merchandise and helping customers find everything from hairpins to house slippers. She was saving every penny, keeping her money in a coffee can hidden in her closet, counting and recounting the bills with the focused intensity of someone who understood that dreams required sacrifice. Her boyfriend Tommy Caldwell was a sweet boy from the south side of town, all gangly limbs and nervous smiles whenever Frank Morrison was around. He worked at his uncle's garage and had already proposed 3 times. Each proposal met with Linda's gentle but firm insistence that marriage could wait until after she became a nurse. "I want to help people first," she would tell him, her hazel eyes bright with determination. "I want to be somebody who makes a difference." In 1969 Rockford, everyone knew everyone. The mailman knew which houses got letters from sons stationed in Vietnam. The pharmacist knew which families were struggling to pay for prescription medicine. The local barber served as unofficial town therapist, dispensing advice along with haircuts. Secrets were hard to keep in a place where Mrs. O'Brien next door could tell what you were having for dinner just by the smell drifting from your kitchen windows. But some secrets, Linda was about to discover, were darker than others. Some secrets were worth killing for. March 15, 1969 began like any other Saturday in the Morrison household. Patricia made pancakes for breakfast, the kitchen warm and sweet with the smell of maple syrup and butter. Frank read the morning paper, shaking his head at news of anti-war protests spreading across college campuses. Linda ironed her work uniform in the living room while watching cartoons with the neighborhood children who had wandered over, as they always did on Saturday mornings. But something felt different about Linda that day. Her usual cheerful chatter was replaced by distracted silence. She kept checking the clock, biting her lower lip in the way she had since childhood when something was troubling her. When Patricia asked if everything was all right, Linda forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just thinking about the future, Mama," she said, which was true enough, though not in the way her mother understood. Linda arrived at Woolworth's for her 2 p.m. shift carrying the weight of something heavy on her mind. Her co-worker Susan Palmer noticed immediately that Linda seemed nervous, jumpy. She dropped a tray of costume jewelry during the busy afternoon rush, the cheap metals scattering across the linoleum floor with a sound like breaking glass. Linda apologized profusely as she crawled on her hands and knees to collect the scattered pieces, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. The phone call came at exactly 5:30 p.m. The black rotary phone at the employee desk rang with its usual sharp trill, and Linda answered on the second ring. "Woolworth's, this is Linda." Her voice was bright, professional, but within seconds, her face changed. The color drained from her cheeks. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the phone receiver. "I can't," Linda whispered into the phone, glancing around to make sure no customers were listening. "We talked about this. I told you no." There was a long pause as the caller responded. Linda's breathing became shallow, rapid. "That's not, you can't make me." Another pause. Then, in a voice so quiet Susan had to strain to hear it, "Fine. But this is the last time. After tonight, it's over." Linda hung up the phone with shaking hands. She stood there for a moment, staring at the black plastic receiver as if it might ring again. When Susan asked if everything was okay, Linda just nodded and returned to straightening the cosmetics display, but her movements were mechanical, distracted. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of forced smiles and nervous glances at the clock. When 6:45 p.m. arrived, Linda gathered her purse and coat with unusual haste. She said goodbye to Susan, her voice tight with stress. "See you Monday," she called over her shoulder as she pushed through the glass doors. But Monday would come and go without Linda Morrison ever returning to Woolworth's. The March evening was crisp but not bitter, with the kind of wind that promised spring was fighting to break through winter's stubborn grip. Street lamps were just beginning to flicker on as Linda walked east on State Street, her red coat bright against the gathering dusk. She walked quickly, purposefully, but kept glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be following her. Mrs. Dorothy Henkel was sweeping her front porch when Linda passed under the streetlight at State and Madison. Something about the girl's posture troubled her. Linda's shoulders were hunched, her head down, like someone carrying a burden too heavy for her young frame. Mrs. Henkel almost called out to her, almost asked if she needed a ride somewhere. Years later, she would replay that moment in her mind 1,000 times, wondering if a simple act of kindness might have changed everything. By 7:15 p.m., Linda had reached Riverside Park. The park was mostly empty at that hour, just a few dog walkers and teenagers sharing cigarettes behind the pavilion. That's when Bobby Crawford, 16 years old and hurrying home before his curfew, saw Linda talking to someone in a dark sedan parked near the walking trail. The car was a late-model Ford or Chevy, dark blue, or black. In the gathering darkness, colors blended together. The driver's window was rolled down, and Linda was leaning toward it, her hands pressed against the car door. From where Bobby stood 50 yards away, the conversation appeared intense, urgent. Linda's posture suggested she was arguing with whoever was behind the wheel. When Bobby looked again 5 minutes later, both Linda and the car were gone. The final sighting came at 7:34 p.m. from Mr. Albert Peterson, who was taking his evening walk with his fox terrier Rusty along the path that wound through the trees toward the Rock River. He saw a young woman in a red coat standing motionless by the trail entrance, her hands shoved deep in her pockets. She seemed to be waiting for someone, checking her watch repeatedly. Mr. Peterson nodded politely as he passed, but Linda didn't seem to notice him at all. When Mr. Peterson returned from his walk 20 minutes later, the girl in the red coat was nowhere to be seen. The forest had swallowed her up as completely as if she had never existed at all. Patricia Morrison knew something was wrong the moment she glanced at the kitchen clock and saw 8:15 p.m. staring back at her. Linda had never, not once in her 19 years, missed dinner without calling. The pot roast sat congealing in its pan, the vegetables growing cold, the carefully set table a monument to a family routine that had suddenly, inexplicably, been broken. Frank Morrison tried to calm his wife's growing panic with rational explanations. Maybe Linda had stopped by a girlfriend's house. Maybe she was having ice cream with Tommy Caldwell. Maybe she was browsing at the library and lost track of time. But even as he spoke the words, Frank felt the cold weight of dread settling in his stomach. Linda wasn't impulsive. Linda was responsible. Linda always called. By 9 p.m., Patricia was pacing the living room floor, pausing at the window every few minutes to scan Cherry Street for any sign of her daughter's red coat. Frank called Tommy Caldwell first, then Linda's girlfriends, then every Morrison family member in town. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. With each phone call, the awful truth became more undeniable. Linda Morrison was missing. The initial call to the Rockford Police Department was handled with the weary professionalism of officers who dealt with missing teenager reports almost weekly. Sergeant Bill Murphy took down the basic information with polite efficiency. 19 years old, 5 foot 4 inches, brown hair, hazel eyes. Last seen leaving her job at Woolworth's around 7 p.m. No history of running away. No recent troubles at home or school. She's probably with friends, Sergeant Murphy assured Frank Morrison. 9 times out of 10, these girls turn up by morning with some story about losing track of time. If she's not home by tomorrow afternoon, give us another call. But Detective Ray Sullivan, 32 years old and relatively new to the Rockford force, felt different about the Linda Morrison case from the moment he heard the details. Maybe it was Patricia Morrison's genuine terror when she appeared at the police station at 10:30 p.m., her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking so badly she could barely sign the missing person report. Maybe it was Frank Morrison's quiet dignity as he described his daughter's responsible nature, her dreams of nursing school, her devotion to her family. Or maybe it was something more instinctive, the gut feeling that had served Sullivan well during his 5 years in law enforcement. This wasn't a runaway. This was something else entirely. Sullivan began making calls that Saturday night, reaching out to the officers who worked the downtown beat. Had anyone seen a young woman in a red coat? Any disturbances near Riverside Park? Any unusual activity around the Rock River walking trails? The answers were discouraging. Downtown Rockford on a Saturday night was busy, chaotic. People came and went. A girl in a red coat could have disappeared into the crowd as easily as a drop of water into the ocean. By Sunday morning, when Linda still hadn't returned home, Sullivan convinced his sergeant to authorize an official search. Within hours, half the town seemed to have mobilized. Church groups canceled their Sunday services to join search parties. Local businesses closed their doors so employees could comb through Riverside Park and the surrounding woods. High school students, teachers, housewives, and retirees formed human chains that stretched along every trail, behind every building, through every patch of brush that might conceal a missing girl. The search of Riverside Park began at dawn on Sunday, March 16th. Volunteers spread out in coordinated groups, calling Linda's name and beating the bushes with sticks and improvised tools. The morning air was sharp with the smell of wet earth and melting snow, and every shadow seemed to hold the promise of discovery. At 11:43 a.m., the first piece of evidence was found. Linda's black leather purse lay partially hidden beneath a pile of dead leaves about 50 yards from the main walking trail. The purse was open, its contents scattered, a wallet with $12 still inside, a compact mirror with a spiderweb crack across its surface, tubes of lipstick and mascara, her Woolworth's name tag, a small notebook where she kept track of her savings for nursing school. 20 minutes later, volunteer searcher Margaret O'Connell spotted something red caught in the brambles near a fallen oak tree. Linda's left shoe, a black loafer with a sensible low heel, sat upright in the mud as if Linda had simply stepped out of it and walked away barefoot. But there was no sign of Linda herself. No footprints leading deeper into the woods. No torn clothing caught on branches. No trail of any kind to follow. Detective Sullivan stood in the small clearing where Linda's belongings had been found, trying to read the scene like a book written in a language he didn't quite understand. The purse and shoe were too deliberately placed, too easy to find. This felt staged. Someone had wanted these items to be discovered, but why? What story were they meant to tell? As the sun set on Sunday evening and the search parties reluctantly disbanded, Sullivan made a promise to Patricia Morrison that would haunt him for the next 2 decades. Standing in the Morrison family kitchen, his uniform muddy and his voice hoarse from calling Linda's name all day, he looked into the desperate eyes of a mother whose world had just collapsed. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "I give you my word. I won't stop looking until we bring Linda home." It was a promise that would consume his career, destroy his marriage, and ultimately lead him to a truth so shocking that it would shatter everything he thought he knew about human nature. The weeks following Linda Morrison's disappearance blurred together in a monotonous cycle of leads that led nowhere and hope that slowly withered like flowers left too long without water. Detective Ray Sullivan's desk became a shrine to the case. Photographs of Linda pinned to a corkboard, maps of Rockford marked with colored pins showing every place she'd been seen, boxes of witness statements and police reports that grew thicker with each passing day. Every tip was investigated. Every lead was pursued. A waitress in Chicago called to report a young woman matching Linda's description working at a diner on the south side. Sullivan drove 3 hours to interview a scared 19-year-old who bore only the slightest resemblance to Linda Morrison. A truck driver claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker in a red coat near the Wisconsin border. Sullivan spent 2 days tracking down the girl, only to discover she was a runaway from Milwaukee who had never heard of Rockford, Illinois. The false sightings came weekly, then monthly, each one sending Patricia Morrison's heart racing with desperate hope that quickly curdled into devastating disappointment. Linda was spotted in Iowa, working at a grocery store. Linda was living with a commune in California. Linda was married to a farmer in Nebraska, too ashamed of some imagined disgrace to contact her family. Each report was investigated thoroughly, professionally, and each report led to the same crushing conclusion. This was not Linda Morrison. By 1971, 2 years after Linda's disappearance, the case had officially gone cold. New crimes demanded attention. New victims needed justice. Sullivan was reassigned to other cases, though he continued working Linda's file during his off hours, driven by a promise he couldn't forget and an obsession he couldn't shake. The physical evidence was frustratingly limited. The purse and shoe found in Riverside Park had yielded no fingerprints other than Linda's own. The crime scene, if it could even be called a crime scene, had been contaminated by dozens of well-meaning volunteers before proper forensic procedures could be established. This was 1969, before DNA testing, before criminal profiling, before the sophisticated investigative techniques that would later revolutionize law enforcement. Sullivan interviewed Linda's family members repeatedly, searching for any detail that might provide a clue to her fate. He spoke with her brothers Michael, Patrick, and David, each of whom had solid alibis for the night of Linda's disappearance. Michael had been working the evening shift at the foundry. Patrick was studying for midterm exams at Northern Illinois University. David, the youngest of Linda's brothers, was at home with his parents, watching television and finishing homework. The questioning extended to the broader Morrison family circle. Linda's uncle Robert, Frank Morrison's younger brother, had been particularly helpful during the initial search efforts. Robert worked construction and lived with his wife Margaret in a small house on the west side of town. He expressed genuine grief over Linda's disappearance and volunteered to distribute missing person flyers throughout Winnebago County. As the years passed, the Morrison family began to fracture under the weight of unresolved grief. Frank Morrison, who had always been a quiet man, retreated into an even deeper silence. He would sit for hours in his favorite chair, staring out the window at Cherry Street as if Linda might materialize on the sidewalk at any moment. Patricia threw herself into maintaining Linda's bedroom exactly as her daughter had left it. The nursing textbooks still stacked on the nightstand, the acceptance letters still pinned to the bulletin board, the coffee can full of saved money still hidden in the closet. The strain on the Morrison marriage became unbearable. Frank blamed himself for not driving Linda home from work that night. Patricia blamed herself for not insisting Linda find a different job, somewhere safer than downtown Rockford. They began sleeping in separate bedrooms, eating meals in silence, existing as strangers in their own home. By 1974, they were divorced, another casualty of Linda's disappearance. Linda's brothers Michael and Patrick moved away from Rockford, unable to bear the constant reminder of their sister's fate. David, who had been closest to Linda despite their age difference, stayed in town to look after their mother, but the burden of being the family's sole remaining son aged him prematurely. He married young, had children quickly, and threw himself into the routines of normal life with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun his own memories. Detective Sullivan's obsession with the Linda Morrison case cost him his own marriage. His wife, Carol, grew tired of competing with a ghost for her husband's attention. She was tired of canceled dinners because Sullivan had received another tip about Linda. She was tired of finding crime scene photographs spread across their kitchen table. She was tired of watching the man she loved disappear into a maze of unsolved questions that seemed to have no exit. "She's gone, Ray," Carol said during one of their final arguments in 1976. "Linda Morrison is gone, and you can't bring her back. But you're going to lose everything else trying." Carol was right, of course, but Sullivan couldn't let go. Even after his divorce, even after his promotion to sergeant required him to supervise other detectives rather than work cases directly, he continued to spend his evenings in the basement of his small apartment, surrounded by boxes of evidence and photographs, trying to find the one clue that would solve the mystery of what happened to Linda Morrison. The case file grew thicker, but no clearer. Suspects were investigated and cleared. Theories were developed and discarded. Physical evidence was tested and retested with each new advancement in forensic science, but the results remained frustratingly inconclusive. By the 1980s, Linda Morrison's disappearance had become Rockford folklore, a cautionary tale parents told their teenage daughters about the dangers of walking alone at night. Her picture appeared in the local newspaper each year on the anniversary of her disappearance, accompanied by shorter and shorter articles as new tragedies pushed her story further into the past. But some people never forgot. Patricia Morrison, now living alone in the house on Cherry Street, continued her vigil. Detective Sullivan, even after his retirement in 1995, kept boxes of case files in his garage. And somewhere in the shadows, the person responsible for Linda's disappearance continued living their life, carrying their secret like a cancer that grew larger and more malignant with each passing year. What none of them knew was that the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along, wrapped in the comfortable disguise of family bonds and protected by the unthinkable assumption that evil couldn't possibly live so close to home. For 54 years, Patricia Morrison lived with a question that had no answer and a hope that refused to die. Every morning, she would wake up in the same house on Cherry Street where Linda had grown up, and for just a moment, that brief space between sleep and full consciousness, she would forget. She would listen for the sound of Linda's footsteps on the stairs, the rattle of breakfast dishes in the kitchen, the cheerful voice calling "Morning, Mama" from down the hall. Then reality would crash down like a weight, and Patricia would remember Linda was gone. Linda's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it on March 15, 1969. The same floral bedspread, the same stack of nursing textbooks, the same small mirror on the dresser where Linda had applied her lipstick that final morning. Patricia dusted the room every week, changed the sheets every month, and kept fresh flowers on the nightstand. Daisies, Linda's favorite, when they were in season. Neighbors and family members had gently suggested, over the years, that Patricia might find peace in packing away Linda's belongings. But Patricia couldn't bear the thought of erasing her daughter's presence from the world. "What if she comes home?" she would ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if she comes home and her room is gone? What will she think happened to us?" The annual memorial services began in 1974, 5 years after Linda's disappearance. Patricia organized them herself, placing advertisements in the Rockford Register-Star and posting flyers at local churches. The first service filled the entire sanctuary of First Methodist, where the Morrison family had attended services every Sunday since before Linda was born. Linda's high school friends came, their young faces already showing the first signs of the adult lives they were building. Her co-workers from Woolworths attended, along with neighbors who remembered the bright girl in the red coat. But as the years passed, the memorial services grew smaller. Linda's friends moved away, started families, built lives in other towns. Her co-workers retired or found different jobs. The circle of people who remembered Linda Morrison as a living, breathing person rather than a tragic story gradually shrank, until the annual gatherings consisted mostly of Patricia, a few elderly neighbors, and Detective Ray Sullivan, who never missed a service even after his retirement. Sullivan had become more than just the detective assigned to Linda's case. He had become Patricia's closest friend and confidant. Every few months, he would stop by the house on Cherry Street for coffee and conversation. They would sit at the kitchen table where Linda had eaten her last breakfast, sharing memories and theories, hope and despair in equal measure. "I keep thinking she's going to walk through that door," Patricia would say, her gaze fixed on the front hallway. "I keep thinking she's just going to appear one day with some explanation for where she's been all this time." Sullivan understood. He had spent so many years imagining Linda's return that she had become almost real to him. Not the 19-year-old girl who had disappeared in 1969, but the middle-aged woman she would have become. In his mind, she was a nurse, probably married, maybe with children of her own. She was successful and happy and living somewhere far from Rockford, unable to return for reasons that would make perfect sense once she explained them. But as Patricia entered her 70s, then her 80s, the weight of not knowing began to crush her spirit. Her health declined steadily. Arthritis, high blood pressure, the gradual failing of organs that had carried too much sorrow for too long. She began to speak of her greatest fear, dying without ever learning what had happened to her daughter. "The not knowing is worse than the worst truth you could tell me," she confided to Sullivan during one of his visits in 2018. "If someone killed her, at least I could hate them. If she ran away, at least I could understand why. But this emptiness, it's eating me alive." Patricia's other children, the sons who had moved away, started families, built lives beyond the shadow of their sister's disappearance, visited when they could. But the visits were awkward, strained by the weight of Linda's absence. Patricia's entire identity had become wrapped up in being Linda Morrison's mother, the woman whose daughter had vanished without a trace. She couldn't talk about anything else for very long. Every conversation eventually circled back to Linda, to the night she disappeared, to the endless questions that had no answers. David Morrison, the youngest of Linda's brothers and the only one who had remained in Rockford, bore the heaviest burden. He felt responsible for their mother's welfare, guilty about his siblings' absence, and haunted by memories of the sister he had adored. David had been only 14 when Linda disappeared, just beginning to navigate his own teenage years when his family was torn apart by tragedy. Now in his 60s, David would visit his mother every Sunday after church, just as she had visited her own mother decades earlier. They would sit in the living room surrounded by photographs of Linda. Linda as a baby, Linda starting school, Linda in her high school graduation gown, Linda on her last Christmas morning, opening presents with the joy of someone who had no idea how little time she had left. "I dream about her sometimes," Patricia told David during one of these visits. "She's still 19, still my little girl. But in the dreams, she's trying to tell me something important, and I can never quite hear what she's saying." The dreams, Patricia believed, were Linda trying to communicate with her from wherever she was, alive or dead, near or far. Patricia had consulted psychics over the years, had attended seances, had even traveled to meet with people who claimed they could contact the dead. None of it had provided any real answers, but it had given her something precious: hope. In 2020, when Patricia turned 91, her doctor told David that his mother might have only months to live. Her heart was failing. Her kidneys were struggling. Her mind remained sharp, but her body was finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of 9 decades of life and 5 decades of grief. That's when Detective Sarah Chen knocked on Patricia Morrison's door, carrying a manila folder that contained the most important news of Patricia's life. But with that news would come a revelation so shocking, so unthinkable, that Patricia would spend her final months wishing she had died without knowing the truth. Some questions she was about to learn were better left unanswered. Detective Sarah Chun had never intended to become obsessed with cold cases. A 15-year veteran of the Rockford Police Department, she had built her reputation solving contemporary crimes, domestic violence cases, drug-related homicides, the kind of tragedies that filled the daily reports of modern law enforcement. But when the department launched its cold case initiative in January 2024, Chun volunteered immediately. Something about the unsolved mysteries appealed to her methodical nature, her belief that every puzzle had a solution if you could just find the right pieces. Linda Morrison's case file landed on Chen's desk on a snowy Tuesday morning in February. The manila folder was thick with decades of accumulated reports, witness statements, and evidence logs, a testament to Detective Ray Sullivan's determined investigation and the scores of tips and leads that had been pursued over the years. Chun spread the contents across her desk like artifacts from an archaeological dig, each document a window into a different era of police work and forensic science. The physical evidence was limited but compelling. Linda's purse and shoe, found in Riverside Park 55 years earlier, had been carefully preserved in the department's evidence room. Chun examined the items with fresh eyes, noting details that earlier investigators might have overlooked. The purse's leather was well preserved, protected by decades of climate-controlled storage. The shoe showed signs of having been deliberately placed rather than lost. No scuff marks or tears that would suggest Linda had been running or struggling when she lost it. But it was Linda's clothing that held the most promise. The red wool coat and the blue work dress she had been wearing were recovered from the woods 2 days after her disappearance, torn and stained with what appeared to be blood and other biological material. In 1969, forensic technology was limited to basic blood typing. By 2024, DNA analysis could extract detailed genetic profiles from samples that were decades old. Chun sent Linda's clothing to the state crime lab with a specific request: test everything. Every stain, every fiber, every microscopic trace of biological material that might have been transferred during Linda's final moments. The wait was excruciating. DNA analysis of degraded samples could take months, and Chun had learned not to get her hopes up about cold cases that were older than she was. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon in April. Lab technician Dr. Michael Rodriguez called Chun personally, his voice tight with excitement. "Detective Chun, you're going to want to sit down for this. We found male DNA on the victim's dress. Not just skin cells, we found semen. And the DNA profile is complete enough to run through the databases." Chun's heart raced as she pulled up the Cody's database on her computer. The combined DNA index system contained genetic profiles from millions of convicted criminals, missing persons, and unidentified remains. If Linda Morrison's attacker had ever been arrested for a felony, if he had ever submitted a DNA sample to law enforcement, the computer would find him within minutes. The search returned no matches. But Chun wasn't discouraged. DNA databases were constantly growing, and new technology had made it possible to use genetic profiles in ways that earlier generations of investigators could never have imagined. Genetic genealogy, the process of using DNA to build family trees and identify suspects, had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. Chun uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database that allowed law enforcement to compare crime scene DNA with the genetic profiles of people who had submitted their information for family history research. The search returned dozens of potential relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared enough genetic material with the unknown suspect to suggest a common ancestor within the past century. Building a family tree from genetic matches was painstaking work that required the skills of a detective and a genealogist combined. Chun worked with a consulting firm that specialized in forensic genealogy, providing them with the DNA profile and asking them to construct a family tree that might lead to their suspect. The work took 3 months. 3 months of tracing marriage records, birth certificates, obituaries, and census data. 3 months of building elaborate family trees that branched in every direction, encompassing hundreds of people across multiple generations. 3 months of narrowing the possibilities, eliminating suspects who had been too young in 1969, too old, or living in other parts of the country. When the genealogist called Chun in July 2024, her voice was subdued, almost apologetic. "Detective Chun, I need to prepare you for what I'm about to tell you. Our analysis indicates that the DNA belongs to someone closely related to the Morrison family. We're talking about a close relative, possibly an uncle or cousin." Chun felt her stomach drop. Family members were always considered during missing person investigations, but Linda's immediate family had been thoroughly investigated in 1969. Her parents, her brothers, her known relatives all had solid alibis for the night of her disappearance. Could the original investigation have missed someone? Could a family member have been involved in Linda's disappearance without anyone suspecting? The genealogist continued, "Based on the genetic markers, we believe the suspect is related through Linda's father's side of the family. We've narrowed it down to 3 possible candidates, all of whom would have been adults in 1969 and living in the Rockford area. The first name on the list was Thomas Morrison, Frank Morrison's cousin, who had died in 1987. The second was James Morrison, another cousin, who had lived in California since 1965. The third name made Chin's blood run cold. Robert Morrison, Frank Morrison's younger brother, Linda's uncle. Chin stared at the name on her computer screen, remembering the police reports she had read about the search for Linda. Robert Morrison had been one of the most helpful volunteers, distributing missing person flyers and organizing search parties. He had comforted Linda's parents. He had attended her memorial services. For 55 years, he had carried his secret while watching the family he had destroyed slowly crumble under the weight of unanswered questions. Chin picked up her phone and began making the calls that would either solve the Linda Morrison case or destroy what remained of the Morrison family forever. Some truths she was about to discover were more devastating than any lie. The Sunset Manor assisted living facility in Clearwater, Florida, was the kind of place where people went to spend their final years in comfortable anonymity. Palm trees swayed in the Gulf Coast breeze outside the windows of the single-story buildings, and residents spent their days playing shuffleboard, watching old movies, and sharing memories of lives that seemed increasingly distant with each passing day. Robert Morrison, 78 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, had been living at Sunset Manor for 3 years. His wife Margaret had died in 2019, and his children had decided that their father needed more care than they could provide. To his fellow residents and the nursing staff, Robert was a gentle old man who talked fondly about his construction career and his family back in Illinois. He kept a photograph of his niece Linda on his nightstand, the missing girl who had disappeared so many years ago, whose fate remained one of life's great mysteries. Detective Sarah Chun arrived at Sunset Manor on August 15, 2024, accompanied by detectives from the Clearwater Police Department and armed with a warrant for Robert Morrison's arrest. The charges were stark and brutal: first-degree murder, sexual assault, and obstruction of justice. But more than the legal charges, Chin carried with her the weight of a truth so devastating that it would destroy everything the Morrison family thought they knew about themselves. Robert was sitting in the facility's common room when the detectives arrived, watching a John Wayne Western on the large-screen television. He looked exactly like what he was, a frail elderly man in a cardigan sweater and slippers, his white hair carefully combed, his hands spotted with age. When Chun introduced herself and explained why she was there, Robert's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, fear, and finally, something that looked almost like relief. "I wondered when someone would finally come," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the television. "I've been waiting for this day for 55 years. The confession came in stages, extracted over several hours of careful questioning in a small office at the Clearwater Police Department. Chin had to work around Robert's dementia, which caused him to drift in and out of lucidity, sometimes forgetting where he was or what year it was. But when it came to the night of March 15th, 1969, his memory was crystal clear, as if the trauma of that evening had burned every detail permanently into his brain. Robert had been 33 years old in 1969, married to Margaret for 8 years, working construction jobs around Rockford, and struggling with what he would later recognize as alcoholism and mental illness. He had developed an unhealthy obsession with his teenage niece Linda, watching her grow from a child into a beautiful young woman, harboring inappropriate thoughts that he tried to suppress but couldn't control. The sexual assault had been going on for 2 years, Robert finally admitted. He had been molesting Linda since she was 17, using his position as her trusted uncle to manipulate and threaten her into silence. Linda had tried to resist, had threatened to tell her parents, but Robert had convinced her that no one would believe her accusations against him. The phone call to Linda at Woolworth's on March 15th had been Robert demanding another meeting. Linda had finally found the courage to refuse, to say that she was going to expose him no matter what the consequences. She was leaving for nursing school in the fall, she told him. She was going to start a new life away from Rockford, and she didn't want his poison following her. She said she was going to tell Frank everything. Robert confessed, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. She said she couldn't keep the secret anymore. She said it was killing her inside, and she'd rather destroy the family than live with what I'd done to her. The meeting in Riverside Park had been Robert's final attempt to convince Linda to keep quiet. He had picked her up in his car, driven her to the secluded area near the Rock River walking trail, and pleaded with her to reconsider. When Linda remained firm in her decision to expose him, Robert had snapped. "I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I just wanted her to stop talking, to listen to me. I put my hands on her throat, just to make her be quiet, and then she stopped breathing." The disposal of Linda's body had been methodical, planned. Robert knew the Rock River well from his construction work, knew where the current was strongest, where a body might be carried downstream and never found. He had weighted Linda's body with concrete blocks and dumped her in the deepest part of the river, miles from where he had killed her. The elaborate staging of the crime scene had been Robert's attempt to throw off the investigation. He had planted Linda's purse and shoe in the park, torn her clothing, and scattered the pieces to suggest she had been attacked by a stranger. Then he had volunteered for the search parties, distributed missing person flyers, and comforted Linda's parents while carrying the knowledge of what he had done. "I thought I could live with it," Robert said, his voice hollow with decades of accumulated guilt. "I thought it would get easier over time. But it didn't. Every day, every year, it got harder. Watching Frank and Patricia destroy themselves looking for answers I could have given them. Watching the family fall apart because of what I'd done." The confession lasted 6 hours. When it was finished, Robert signed the written statement with shaking hands and asked Chin a question that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "Will you tell Patricia I'm sorry? Will you tell her I never meant for any of this to happen?" Chin drove to Rockford the next day to deliver the news to Linda's family. She found Patricia Morrison, now 95 years old and confined to a wheelchair, sitting in the living room of the house on Cherry Street. Linda's photograph still sat on the mantelpiece. Her bedroom was still preserved exactly as she